Welcome to The Joy Report, a podcast dedicated to sharing climate solutions through the lens of intersectionality and optimism. Together, we explore the stories and lessons from changemakers who have dedicated their lives to helping build a better world. I'm your host, Arielle V. King. In this episode, we're exploring education as a climate solution. Climate change education helps people understand and address the impacts of the climate crisis by empowering them with the knowledge, skills, and values needed to act as agents of change. Activist Malcolm X once shared that education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. Preparation is exactly what is required to continue pressing forward in a way that is thoughtful, science-backed, holistic, and human. So to discuss this and so much more, I have invited Brittany Jefferson, an LA-based classroom educator and the teacher behind EJEDU, who has been creating lessons centered on developing student climate literacy in all subject areas. I've been following Brittany for the last 3 or 4 years now on social media, and I'm so incredibly inspired by her work. And so, Brittany, I'm so excited to have you on The Joy Report. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Arielle. I'm so excited to be here. I can't wait for us to talk and dig in.
Yay. So we start every episode by asking our guests, how are you sustaining your joy lately?
I am going on sunset walks. So I recently moved out of the city and into the desert.
Okay.
And the skies are so big here because there's fewer buildings
Sure.
and there's open land. And so the sunset is divine. So it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of my mood building right now, or my mood lifting, and Pilates.
Okay. So movement and nature. That sounds good. What are you reading right now?
I just finished 107 Days, actually.
Okay.
Literally, I just finished it last night.
What were your thoughts on 107 Days?
I have quite a few. I do think it was really disappointing. I liked that Kamala Harris mentioned that she didn't feel that climate was going to hit voters in the very short time she had in the campaign.
Interesting.
And so she made this conscious choice not to talk about it as much. I found it really interesting that she mentioned it, and I think I appreciated the explanation, but I also still found it very disappointing as an environmentalist, because I feel like we're just so behind in policy, and so it's well, okay, people are dying today, but
right.
Yes, so I don't know. I think I'm just kind of over it's a future problem in 2026.
Because it's not. It's a present day problem. It has been a problem for years now. We've known about this problem for years now. Action is required.
And we'll definitely talk about this.
Oh,
but
we will.
The federal government, it's just, at further we go in, I just feel like they're so far behind what we know is to be true and what we need. And so it can get very frustrating.
No, I bet. What was your favorite subject growing up and why?
This is going to seem really on the nose, but history.
I love it. Yeah.
History was my favorite subject. I was so fortunate to have exceptional history teachers all through high school.
Cool.
And they really shaped how I viewed the world. It really shaped my worldview and, my desire to learn, and nonfiction even. I think that a lot of what I've done today and where I am is a testament to the history teachers I had. And I love history. And it was also my favorite subject to teach in the classroom.
That's so cool. Did you have a favorite era that you liked studying about, or did you have a hyperfixation history era growing up? I feel like one of mine is the Harlem Renaissance, for example.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I liked learning about slave revolts.
Okay. I love
and
that.
Rebellions.
Yeah.
I think because, as a teenager, when you're coming of age, right, and you're developing your own identity as you try to merge into adulthood, after you've been conditioned with a narrative of, enslaved people just kind of putting up with their conditions, rebellion and revolution is not a very prominent aspect of our narrative. And so I think once I started learning how folks were opposing, their conditions in a variety of ways and through, extreme circumstances, I was like, yeah, okay. Like I just think that it was another aspect of our resilience that, was kind of awakened when I learned about those things.
Absolutely. So you grew up in LA, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Born and raised.
Born and raised. When was the first time you had a Black teacher?
For me, that's kind of a trick question.
Okay.
Because my earliest caregivers were Black women.
Okay.
So my first exposure to school through kindergarten and first grade was all Black women. I went to a school in Pasadena, Omawali, and it was all Black staff, all Black student body.
That's cool. That's very cool. Do you feel like that experience has influenced the way that you teach and the way that you show up in the world today?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, those memories, I was very young when I first attended that school, but I have moved. I have been in predominantly Black and predominantly not Black spaces.
Yeah.
And they both have really kind of shaped who I am. I think like with that school particularly is just core memories of, your first exposure to school and like what it's like to be in a school building. And I think for that to have, Black pride all over it, yeah, definitely, I think was, key in my development.
I love that. I didn't have my first Black teacher until high school, my high school English teacher.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry too. And I don't know. I think it's so important for us to see ourselves in every aspect of the way that we're living our lives as young people. With that in mind, would you be able to share with our audience a little bit about what EJEDU is?
Yes. So EJEDU is Environmental Justice Education. It is an education services company where I basically fill in the gaps of public education with forward-thinking progressive instruction rooted in the 17 principles of environmental justice. It really started with me in the classroom, and I was a highly trained education professional. I went to PD conferences, professional learning communities. I worked at schools that valued quality professional development. And so all the teachers that were on staff were exceptional teachers. Being an environmentalist just as a human being and then also being a highly trained person, it
Yeah.
just a highly trained professional, it came together and converged very well to form, the consultancy that I'm doing right now, where I'm just working with schools and working with students with programming rooted in climate literacy, environmental education, sustainability, climate action, and really focusing on our local community.
How did you cultivate a love for or a passion for the environment? I'm sure that's like a long story, but yeah.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's ancestral for me. I'm
Yeah.
gonna be honest, it's ancestral. My maternal ancestry is Native. My grandmother is of the Seminole and Choctaw tribal nations.
Okay.
And I recently became a registered member, and my kids became a registered member, and that
Wow.
was like a spiritual experience. I'm
Wow,
so happy. But
congratulations.
thank you. It was ingrained in me through birth. Like, I was raised by my mom and my aunt, and they wouldn't kill bugs.
Mm.
When they would see them, they would take them outside.
Yeah.
And we had lots of cats, and my aunt would take me on her geography field assignments. So I would go to these very cool outdoor places. And she really cultivated like a sense of adventure in the outdoors. She was like, you're just not going to be this prissy, little girl who like doesn't want to get dirty. Like,
Right.
no, you're going to go and you're going to be outside. And my mom was also she thought very much beyond our human constructed systems. Like, she never really fully gave into capitalism and, those ideas of success.
Yeah.
She was really rooted in her relationships with people and how she loved the people in her life. And that was like her priority. Being raised by, these two women were like, that is what they valued. Like, it was just in me. Like, it was just in me to care about the environment and to understand that I am a part of the natural world around us and that life is precious and that it should be fought for and preserved in as many aspects as possible. Like, that should be our goal.
Yeah.
That was just a really big part of how I was shaped as a kid.
Love that. That's so beautiful and so important. And I'm curious, I mean, based on just hearing that, it sounds like environmental justice was kind of inherent in the way that you were showing up and learning, from the time you were a child. And so, how do you currently define environmental justice? But also, what was your maybe introduction to the formal environmental justice movement?
Yeah. Well, first, I was exposed to climate change as an issue through Inconvenient Truth.
Okay. All right. Al Gore.
When
Yes.
I saw that when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman in college. I had come home for Thanksgiving, and my mom was like, "This seems important. We're gonna watch this."
And was.
And it
Yes.
blew my mind.
Yeah,
It blew my mind, but it also connected a lot of things for me that I think I already inherently knew. Was
definitely.
that the way our modern society was built? There's something that isn't right about it. I don't think that it's sustainable, and just not being able to put words into what I think my nervous system might have been feeling.
Sure.
And so that was my first exposure to, like, something is really off between how humans are, how we've built up our society.
Yeah.
Um, and then in 2020 is when I really was able to get, like, the language because of the convergence of COVID and all of us being indoors, but also chronically online.
Yeah.
And, the things that were happening, the murder of George Floyd
Mhm.
and the way that conversations around race in the United States was really put front and center when I feel like the last couple decades it had kind of been it was just, kind of the undercurrent and the
Yes.
undertones, right?
Yeah.
And it was just kind of like on center stage, at a point where I think, Obama being elected president, a lot of, things were kind of building up to, I think, this point.
Yeah.
But the way conversations around race, were put up forefront, so were Black environmentalists, and so
Yes.
were people who understood the connection between colonialism and capitalism and racism with our current climate crisis. And that is where the aspect of justice and environmentalism really converged for me. And I was in this situation in the classroom where, because of distance learning, I had a little bit of freedom in terms of what I was teaching my students because we were in completely uncharted territory.
Sure.
So our directions were just kind of like, okay, these are the subjects you need to do. Like, come up with something, a slide, like however you're gonna, here's the latest ed tech, here's what you're gonna do. And
Wow.
so I just got really creative and I incorporated our 5th grade science and social studies standards, which is United States history
Mhm.
and, earth systems and, like, human impact. Those are 5th grade science standards that are written. And so I was like, oh, this is beautiful. And
Yeah.
that's when I did it. That's when I started creating the lessons and I just started doing, intertwining all of these things and it just grew. And here I am now, doing it every day.
That's so cool and so inspiring. And I love that it almost happened naturally. I'm curious, how did the students respond? Of course, everything was different during COVID, and I'm sure that you're still witnessing some of the impacts of, distance learning and COVID on students today. But when you were first beginning to integrate some of these climate principles into your curricula, how did students respond to that?
So, it kind of changed, I think, throughout the course of my teaching experience. I think when I first started talking to students about it, a lot of kids didn't know what it was. They had never heard about it before and they were
Yeah.
like, "Really? We're doing, like we're doing things that are harming the environment?" And that was surprising. And so that's when I was like, "Oh, I have like a moral obligation to teach this."
Mm.
And then as more time came and like around COVID, students were much more knowledgeable about it. And
Yeah.
so rather than, just kind of being like, have you ever heard of it? I would start conversations with, what do you already know? Or what do you think you know? Um, and, students started coming with like a basic understanding of, human activity is negatively impacting the environment.
Yeah.
And so what I was able to do was kind of dig deeper and richer as it connected to our standards and, colonialism and talking about, the Columbian Exchange and the transatlantic slave trade, how all of those things work together, completely changing the systems and the human societies of these continents, these
Yeah.
entire continents. Like, think about how that's going to impact the land, the ecosystem, you're slashing biodiversity for monocultures, things like that. And the kids would get excited, they're engaged. That's the biggest, like, that was like the first and most immediate benefit of teaching climate literacy, especially justice-centered climate literacy in the classroom, was
Yeah.
the engagement. Students are excited about it.
Wow.
Students have questions about things, and, the adults don't always have a way to talk about it in a way that's age appropriate and also interesting.
Yes.
And so, kids would get very excited to talk about it and their minds would be blown, and we would be having these really great conversations around, his different historical topics or different practices, today.
That is so cool and so fascinating. Did any of the kids do you have any, like, funny stories of, like, how the students were reacting to this, like, new information or contextualizing history in this new way through a climate literacy lens?
One student in particular, we were writing, it was a fantasy unit,
Mm,
actually, and they
okay.
wanted to incorporate, like, the aspect of climate change into their fantasy story. And
Wow.
so they had come up with this story where there were alternate universes. And in one universe, people came together and they collectively dealt with, human induced climate change
Yeah.
and what society would be like if they did that. And then in the other universe, people were dealing with the impacts of the inaction
Wow.
and like what things would be like if humans didn't act. Um And, that wasn't the assignment. The assignment was just to write. It was just, this was language arts.
Yeah.
We're doing a fantasy story and we're talking about the components of fantasy storytelling. And for them to want to make that connection to something that we had already learned was so cool. Like, it was, it's very, very cool as a teacher to witness those moments. A moment that, like, what always like fill me up is when we would do our novel studies and our read alouds. I would get really into it. Like, I'm doing characters, I'm changing up my inflection. Like, I'm getting really into it.
Yeah.
And we read Paradise on Fire. And the kids, so I had a student who, he was not a reader. He did not like reading. It was a lot of work to try to get him interested in stories, and he was absent when we finished the book.
Oh.
And he was like, "Oh no, Miss Jefferson, I'm gonna need to borrow that book. I need to see what happened. I need to
Oh.
see what happened." And so, we ended up like reading it together. Like, we took, those last like 10 pages and we read it, and, so I could give him an opportunity. And he was just like, he was so into it. And that's what it was about for me,
Yeah.
at that time, was having these light bulb moments or just seeing something grow within a student that is rooted in nature or storytelling or the environment in any kind of way.
That is so incredible and so inspiring. And also, just in general, I'm a firm believer that science fiction and fantasy are underutilized solutions and like a really important way for us to envision a different world, good or bad. And I think it has the potential to influence policy and the way that we're engaging with the world and so many other things. And so I just love that you shared that story just now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So for our listeners, would you just simply define what climate literacy is or however you define it?
Yeah, I keep it very simple. Like the way I imagine climate literacy is, human impact on Earth systems
Mhm.
and vice versa, and just understanding the basic elements that come together when we think about human impact on Earth systems very specifically.
Okay.
Um, and I think where my work kind of is differentiated is that justice aspect, where we are going to be, if I'm in charge of the conversation and we're engaging in conversations around human impact,
Mhm.
we are going to dig deeper and we're going to learn about different groups of people that are not normally, taught within our social studies and our historical standards and frameworks. Black people don't actually appear in the California state standards for fifth grade until enslavement. And for me, I'm just like, well, I refuse to formally discuss Black people in my curriculum first and foremost with enslavement. So I created
Yeah.
an African civilizations unit,
Mm.
where we're going to be talking about, Black sovereignty and Black societies and values and the contributions to, humanity pre-colonialism. And so, you know, yeah, those are like the elements where I try to dig deeper into what we are teaching or what I'm, kind of responsible for.
Amazing.
And just how I enrich what climate literacy actually means.
Yeah. I think, so many of us didn't have that growing up. And I'm just so excited that there is a new generation of teachers who are equipped with the knowledge and students who are excited and get to learn these things so that they can go out into the world and make a difference and create an impact. And I'm also just continually inspired by the way that you educate other teachers. So I know that you sell and offer your curricula to other teachers. I'm curious, in the age of, and attempts to erase history and other forms of censorship occurring throughout the government in what Kimberly Crenshaw often calls a war on truth, have you noticed any trends or pushback to your curricula given this current presidential administration?
I don't think what I am noticing is pushback.
Okay.
I think what I am noticing is a deprioritization.
Mm,
And so because I do work in a very liberal leaning school community.
okay.
I also am in a very, blue city. I think that, and so with that being said, a lot of times, things aren't as necessarily like blatant as in pushback. Sometimes it's just, we are telling you that it's not as important right now because we have other priorities or we have limited resources.
Mm,
And so I think that the biggest thing that I'm experiencing right now is it being a lack of priority in higher up education systems.
got
And
it.
so what I've had to do is I've had to figure out how to be flexible and also how to, present this as, this is an essential. This is
Yeah.
also the way the education policy is going. The
Yes.
California State Department of Education is, you know, requiring requiring these topics be taught.
Yeah.
And so, like these, I think that people don't necessarily understand the importance of human impact on earth systems around us as just like a fundamental knowledge set or like content that is important for every developing human being. And so, yeah, I'm just really trying to advocate and really educate adults at the same time about, the importance of this in our instruction. It really is, critical to a sustainable future that we have a climate literate workforce, right? We want
Absolutely.
adults of all, no matter what industry they want to go in, we want them to come to it with the sustainability lens so that we can be working in a more efficient, more nature forward way that increases the quality of life for everyone, right? That's what our
Yeah.
job is as members of a community. So that's me trying to sell it to us.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sold. I was already sold. In a world where everyone did have that education, what do you think that world would look like?
I think that we would see a more artisanal economy,
Say
with
more.
smaller and more like smaller and mid-sized businesses. I
Okay.
think that, one of the core principles of environmental justice is like down with multinational corporations.
Yeah.
And I think that, in the age of 2026 and, our federal government and current, oligarchs in charge,
Yeah.
like it's that multinational corporations don't have the best means for the people in mind,
Right.
even though everything that they have comes from our labor, from our wallet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that we would see more businesses, more in people going out independently and contributing to what, our society. I would definitely love to see bolstered, public transit,
Yes.
more walkability,
Yeah.
just more greenery, just built into our infrastructure, solar panels everywhere. I'm
Yeah.
already seeing that in the desert. The California desert
Good.
is,
That's
kind of
really
a
good
front
to
is
hear.
definitely a renewable energy frontier.
Yes.
My entire neighborhood has solar.
Cool.
All, and there's wind turbines, kind of look in the mountains and everything. So like it's renewable energy everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I imagine when I see, when I think of just a climate literate workforce is
Yeah.
those immediate things that we know that we need to address kind of bolstered in our cities.
Exactly. And finding a way for every single industry to consider climate in all of their decision making. So, something that I've seen you talk about online is the importance of the Constitution as something that should be included in climate literacy. Would you just be able to explain to our listeners why you believe that the Constitution is an important climate literacy element?
Yes. So civic engagement, first and foremost, is an aspect of climate literacy that I think is both polarized and marginalized. I have this thought that like politics is both nothing and everything at the same time. Like,
Mhm.
because I grew up in a household that saw past capitalism and saw past, the idea that consuming and, financial success is the only way to fulfillment.
Yeah.
I think that I've understood that like it shouldn't like your political affiliations shouldn't necessarily dictate sustainability.
Yeah.
Like and learning how those two things are integrated, I think is really important. And so with with politics, also whether or not a city has a crosswalk or a stop sign or a traffic light, right, is politics.
Absolutely.
And, the amount of funding that your school libraries get, your homeless shelters get, your public goods, right, is politics.
Yeah.
And how we are engaging in our community, we want to, if we're complaining about how our leaders are, advocating and delegating our resources, then we have to get involved in politics
Yes.
because it is everything that, impacts our daily lives. And so I think as the Constitution, just as American citizens, like understanding fundamental, the fundamental ideals in our country is extremely important in terms of how you're going to be able to navigate getting our systems on board with sustainable changes.
Yeah.
And I think I think we often lose sight of, because it's so boring and tedious. Like, I don't particularly enjoy voting, when our state ballot measures and I'm
Sure.
going through at all of these
Yeah.
judges' names, right? Like, it's not a fun process,
Right.
but it's important, right?
Extremely.
And
Yeah.
it's, like the choices that are made have real impacts. You know,
Mhm.
we can elect judges,
Yeah.
right? We talk about
Yeah.
criminal justice reform, but we don't know anything about the judges in our cities, right? Like,
Mhm.
and so I think the Constitution, just for me, is kind of this like ideal of like a founding document, and just the importance of understanding how our governments work and participating in that, because we are directly impacted by these decisions. And, you know, also because it's like it's required in our learning, you know, as United States K-12 public school system. And understanding, I think, at a federal level, can help us more understand at our local level, where I think our
Yeah,
impacts are most deeply felt.
definitely. Yes. What is social and emotional learning? It's another thing that I've seen you talk about online. What is that?
Yes, yes, yes. I get so fired up about social emotional learning. I think because a lot of people understand it as this very like shallow, or like this buzzword that is new age teaching. And really what it is understanding how children are developing psychologically, you know, at the age, whatever age that they are that you're teaching, whether it be elementary school or secondary
Yeah.
or high school, right? And being able to teach them how to have healthy interactions with people around them, and how to be able to name how they're feeling in situations and have conversations. And I think to demystify conflict, social emotional learning is really understanding that our children are human beings rather than empty vessels that we're there to pour skills and information to. And so it's just part of growing and cultivating an entire human being.
I love that. I wish that were the norm. I wish that were the standard. So, maybe one day we will get there and that will be the common practice. How do you practice social and emotional learning in the classroom?
First and foremost is just kind of interacting with students, you know, in a way that like honors their humanity.
Yeah.
So, you know, try to start every day, you know, positively with smiles. And like I'm gonna name the small stuff, but it's
Yeah.
also big stuff.
Of
So
course.
because I know
Yeah.
that there's gonna be teachers out there that roll their eyes with like, you know, you smile and you greet them and you know, by name or what, you know, things like that.
But
But
those
it's
things do
real when you
matter.
yeah,
Yeah.
like it's real. Like, you know, actually saying hi so and so, like saying their
Mhm.
name, you know, and
Yep.
I used to force my kids to greet me in some kind of way. Like even if you're in a bad mood, you're at least gonna wave.
Yeah.
We acknowledge each other's humanity. That's it. That's
That's
all
the
a
bare
greeting
minimum.
is you're acknowledging the
Absolutely.
presence of another human being in the room with you.
Yeah.
So it would look like that, you know. I'm also not a teacher that was like we have to be completely quiet and in line and in the hallway. I'm
Mm.
okay with the little conversation. You know, we're walking to and from recess. I'm checking in with the student one on one, you know, asking them questions. At the beginning of the year, we do a lot of identity assignments. So I give them surveys so that I can see what kind of music they like, what kind of TV they watch, you know, and so what shows they watch. I'll get stickers, you know, if I know the kids like books, I'm recommending because I'm bookish too. We can read together,
Yeah.
right? So like things like that. But then also in the more formal aspect, I'm also teaching lessons based on things that I'm seeing. So for
Yeah.
example, I would see kids, you know, they're just like little naggy stuff. You know how kids are fighting over a pencil, or, you know, somebody accidentally bumped into someone, but then they turned around and automatically put right? So I would develop a lesson on the difference between escalating during conflict or de-escalating during conflict,
Mm.
right? You're going to continue to escalate if the person who you're talking to starts raising their voice, or maybe they start using swear words, or maybe they like insult you, right? And then you get upset and you put your hands on them. But de-escalating, if you know, keep a calm voice, maybe you're asking questions about what happened. Maybe you bring a lens of understanding, right? And so just giving them just like little steps on how we interact, right? We would talk about appropriate touch and inappropriate touch,
Mhm.
because sometimes, you know, as adults, we might automatically think sexual, but no, the kids are just wrestling.
Right.
They're rolling around on the couch and like
Yeah.
that's not appropriate for school,
Right.
you know?
Right.
So we talk about, you know, like inviting, how to like invite or how to politely decline. Maybe you don't want a
Mm,
hug right now. I don't want
yeah.
you touching me right now.
Yeah.
This is how you have conversations without it becoming an argument with, so that everybody or as many people as possible can feel safe in the learning community, because we all have to feel safe in order for learning to be happening in the first place.
100%. I think on the line of safety, I've been so curious about this just across the board, but how has the increase of ICE presence in our communities impacted either the way you're teaching right now or the way that students are engaging with the learning environment?
It's definitely like on a day to day now, it's kind of like an undertone,
Sure.
and it's, like a feeling. I think people are heightened. We are often like very aware of ICE presence.
Hmm.
Um, and there are instances where, students, family members have experienced, detainment
Yeah.
or have had encounters. And so I think because typically the school community that like I come from, it's a very nurturing and social emotional learning forward environment. And so, everyone from the office staff to, the administration to, any teacher that you might interact with, down the hall is going to understand your humanity and be able to engage in some kind of conversation around, feelings and grief and things like that. Our school, would have infrastructure around, okay, when big things are happening, you might want to have a morning circle with your class today just to check in. If
Yeah.
you're not doing it every day, today might be the day that or, just kind of, here's what you can do if, your student says A, B, and C, or
Yeah.
what they're experiencing and things like that, or any kind of questions or conversations that they might spark up around, things that are happening. Um, yeah, and, lots of, like, procedures and, understanding what to do, different precautions, I hate to say this, but schools have become trained in crisis management,
It's true.
and I think that we're just becoming more flexible and resilient on how we manage crises, because there's many different ones that we're confronted with having to prepare for.
All the time. Yeah. Teachers don't get paid enough. We need to pay the
Really.
teachers, pay the teachers. Oh my goodness. Are you noticing the impacts of the literacy crisis amongst the students you work with? And if so, how are you working to address it through the curriculum that you create? You touched on this a bit, but yeah, if you had any other points to mention on this note.
Yes, I want more people to be alarmed about the literacy crisis.
I'm
I
extremely
want everyone
alarmed.
to understand, like, I
Yeah.
yes, like, I really want everyone to understand how detrimental this is, like, just to society.
Yeah.
But I also want people to understand that the United States has never been particularly good at teaching reading.
Interesting.
The
Okay.
history of American public schools, like, it's implementation and practice, right, is always what happens first, and
Mm,
then the science and the research and the understanding come after, and
makes
so there is
sense.
always a big gap in between the practice and the research and the knowledge. So, there have been studies for the last few decades around the best ways to teach children reading, and because of corporate interests and capitalism and testing companies and things like that, like, our priorities as a public school system just are constantly pivoting towards whatever the latest thing that comes out is, and it's always counterintuitive to the research, right? Like, there's research coming out that ed tech is not a quality way to impact students' literacy, right?
And what
There's a
is ed
debate
tech?
around, so ed tech is educational, like, websites or programs that are
Okay,
designed to, like, take that are designed to, teach different skills. So some there's
got it.
math, it's a lot of math and reading.
Mhm.
There's actually an episode of Abbott Elementary about this where they get a new like reading system,
Oh,
and
yeah?
Janine is very excited, and like old school Barbara, like she can't work the text. So she's like, I've been teaching for 30 years. Like I'm going to teach
Yeah.
reading the way I always know how to teach reading.
Mm,
I think because of just like the capitalist and consumerist nature of our, general society, I think that impacts our school leaders when they're choosing and they're choosing
absolutely.
curriculums and things. Also, the people who are in the district and that are making the choices oftentimes have never taught.
Ugh, wow. It's an issue across
So,
industry, right? Yeah.
right. There's also No Child Left Behind and
Mm,
testing and the priorities put on testing and like teaching students isolated skills without giving them any type of context. And what
yeah,
human development tells us is that children need schema in order to be able to learn and grow. They need connections to things that they already know in order to be able to expand. Also, like reading is not an inherently human skill. It has to be taught
right.
explicitly. So
Yeah,
phonics instruction and, decoding are extremely important aspects of reading. We also can't teach reading skills in isolation without rich content.
yes.
If we're reading very watered down stories or we're not reading, very narrow perspective informational texts or,
Mhm.
things that don't dig deep into motives or how a certain historical event, cost this group of people over here their livelihood or their land or
Yeah,
etc. Right? If we're not having deep, rich conversations, then the knowledge can't really expand because it's all very superficial.
right.
Right. And so understanding how content, knowledge, information, understanding how things work is also imperative to reading comprehension. Like
Yeah,
and so when we are trying to replace our brain's activity with swiping, or when we're having the machines do the critical thinking on our behalf, our brains are not developing in the ways that they can. I'm not sure if you heard about the recent study that came out that Gen Z is like the first generation to not be smarter than the previous generation.
I did not hear about this study.
Yeah, which I think
Wow.
makes millennials the smartest generation alive right now,
That's
just
yeah,
saying.
I think that is what that means, right? But might be
But
coming for y'all, I will say. Um,
but it's, it's largely connected to the prominence of AI and
yeah,
ed tech
yeah.
in, the lack of development in our students' brains. There are so many things I think that are converging right now. And so when you see like the more analog, people are going analog, the
Yep,
analog movement
yeah,
and, like physical books,
yes,
um, it's because of these things. And so I want everyone to understand that school cannot be the only place where your kids are reading. Please make them read at home
yes,
at all ages.
yeah.
Even if your kid is 17 and they're on their way out, make them read a book. I'm making my 16-year-old read. We're all reading. We're doing a family book club right now.
I love that.
Like because it's really really important. And like read with your kids, like hear them read aloud. If you haven't heard them read in a while, like grab a book off the shelf and go to the library. Please use your
To
libraries.
the
um
libraries, yes.
yes, yes, yes. And it can even like just spark your child's interest. Like books just open up worlds for children that may not have been in your purview. Let's not limit them to the algorithm. Let's take them to the library.
There's so much more out there than what's on our phones, it's so true. And there's so much more opportunity for connection when we are spending less time behind screens. So,
Yes. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So, what advice would you give someone who didn't receive climate education in their curricula and didn't study it in school, but want to get involved in climate action as an adult?
Yeah, I would definitely say check your like in your neighborhood, in your city, like one thing that I have noticed from the time that I first watched An Inconvenient Truth 20 years ago to now in 2026, you know, like climate and sustainability are farther at the like forefront of our minds and in our communities than ever before. There are groups popping up, there's publications, you know, and magazines and things like that everywhere that you can learn about different aspects, because also climate is not just going, you know, and like planting trees.
Oh,
You know what I mean? Like
it has to
it's
be
not
about so much
just
more than that.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's so much more than that. And like talking about it, asking questions with people around you. You know, I think a really great book, I love All We Can Save, like
Excellent book.
anything by Dr.
Yes.
Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Catherine Hayhoe is a great like journalist. I love following like their newsletters, just kind of getting just so you can get some news, talking with people around you about it, reading about it,
Yes.
finding any type of local group that is talking about it, and so that way you can find out how climate action really fits into your life, because maybe it's
Yeah.
going to a school board meeting and advocating for climate literacy or campus greening at your school district, or maybe you're in construction and so it's for you trying to advocate for different materials or more efficiency, getting training on our more energy efficient construction technology, whether it be like heat pumps or solar installation, right? Like just find a way to talk about it with the people around you and educate yourself with the people around you so that you can find out how you can apply that to the aspects of your life that are already important.
Absolutely. And so you've already shared a few books and resources, but are there any others that you would recommend to someone wanting to learn more about climate and environmental justice?
I would also recommend following me.
Yeah, definitely. I would recommend following you. Definitely.
I would recommend following me just because I am a teacher first and
Yeah,
foremost. And so a lot of what I post is informative.
it
You know,
is.
like I'm teaching the adults. And so if you just want to know, you know, what about waste management? You know, there's just things like that. What about recycling? Very educational. So
Yeah.
the EJ educator on Instagram. I also have a newsletter on Patreon. So you can also find me on Patreon.
Excellent.
Let's see, intersectional environmentalist, of
Oh,
course, but anybody who's
yes.
listening to the Joy Report is already in, you know, already knows about
Already a little
intersectional
tapped in.
environmentalists.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So we will be sure to add your information in the show notes so that people can find you and support your work. Final question that we like to ask all of our guests is, what is something in the news or in your recent discoveries that has brought you joy lately?
I am really enjoying celebrating wins against AI data centers.
Okay. Me too. What are the most recent ones that you've been excited about?
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'm not prepared with like a location. I want to
No, it's
say it
okay.
was like Memphis, but it was like somewhere in the South. It was a Black
Mhm.
community recently that like advocated against a new data center and they won. And I
Yeah.
was like, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, there are just so many examples. And we just had a Bray Connor, who is the director of climate and environmental justice at the NAACP, and they're like doing a bunch of advocacy against data centers. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be hopeful for on that front, just as there's so many different ways that we can stay connected to the movement against dirty data centers and continue to encourage people to show up effectively to support our community members and our neighbors so that they are being protected. So, yeah, data centers are the best thing to be fighting against right now. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation, Brittany. This has been so wonderful and so informative. And I'm so excited for our listeners to just learn more about you and consider all of the different ways that we should be thinking about climate and really understanding it as an intersectional topic and one that requires a multitude of solutions in order for us to effectively move forward. So, yeah, thank you for your time and thank you for the incredible work that you do. I admire teachers so incredibly deeply. And so it was just truly an honor to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It was really nice to talk to you and meet you. Like, thank
Yes.
you so much for having me. I love seeing the things that you're dabbling into and stuff like
Thank
that.
you.
And, I also love listening to your very soothing voice on The
Oh,
Joy Report.
thank you so much. And so, for our listeners, if you've enjoyed or learned something from this episode, please consider leaving us a review, a rating, sharing this episode with a friend, and keeping the conversation going by posting about it on social media and tagging us. Make sure you're following Intersectional Environmentalist on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack so you don't miss any updates. And remember, fighting the climate crisis is a marathon, not a sprint. We need everyone to get involved in a way that feels right for them now more than ever. Our individual actions do have power, and they're strengthened when we do them as a collective. I'm your host, Arielle V. King, and thank you so much to listening to this episode of The Joy Report. Great. Yay. Thank you so much.